My mother kept a tin box in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser for as long as I can remember, and she never once opened it in front of me. And when I asked her about it as a child, she said it was just old papers, and I believed her the way children believe things that adults say with the particular tone that means the subject is finished. My name is Thomas. I'm 74 years old, and 3 months after my mother's death, I opened that tin box, and what was inside it was not just old papers, and the story I found inside it did not make me angry the way I might have expected it to. But it did something else, something that I am still in the process of fully understanding, which is that it explained my mother to me in a way that nothing in the 68 years I knew her had managed to explain her. And the explanation, arriving after her death, and after a lifetime of not quite understanding the quality of sadness that seemed to live in her beneath everything else, was the most significant gift she ever gave me, even though she did not give it intentionally, and would perhaps not have chosen to give it at all. I want to tell you the whole story, because the whole story is the only honest version, and because the partial version, the version that is simply about a secret discovered after a death, does not begin to account for what the secret actually was, and what it meant, and what it has done to my understanding of a woman I loved for 71 years and thought I knew. My mother's name was Irene. She was born in 1928 in a small city in western Pennsylvania, the daughter of a steelworker and a woman who had emigrated from Poland as a child and who retained, into her old age, a slight accent and a very firm opinion about the correct way to make certain dishes that she was not shy about sharing. My mother grew up in the specific atmosphere of a working-class immigrant household in the 1930s and 1940s, which is to say she grew up with the particular combination of warmth and practicality and the forward-looking orientation of people who understand that what is behind them is not fully available, and that what is ahead requires their full attention and their full effort. She was a bright girl, by all accounts, the kind of girl who might have gone further with her education, if the times and the circumstances had provided the room for it. But the times and the circumstances did not, and she graduated from high school in 1946 and went to work as a secretary at a law firm in downtown Pittsburgh, and began, at 18 years old, what I understood as the start of her adult life. I need to tell you now that this was not the start of her adult life. That is what the tin box told me. Her adult life had started considerably earlier and had contained, before my father and before me, and before the house in the suburbs of Pittsburgh where I grew up, an entire chapter that she had never mentioned, had apparently sealed into a tin box in the bottom drawer of her dresser and kept there, alongside all the ordinary things of her life, for the rest of her life, carrying it the way people carry the heaviest things, without putting it down and without talking about it, and without, so far as I can determine, ever letting anyone who came after know that it existed. My father was a man named Richard, who she married in 1953, when she was 25 years old. My father was a high school history teacher, a careful and gentle man with a dry sense of humor and a genuine love of the subject he taught. And their marriage was, in the way I observed it across my childhood and early adult life, a good marriage, warm and steady and characterized by the particular ease of two people who have been together long enough to have their own language, their own shorthand, their own system of managing the shared life that had been refined across decades into something that worked and that both of them understood and valued. My father died in 1999, and my mother lived another 23 years without him, in the house they had shared for 46 years, and she was, in those 23 years, diminished in the way that people are diminished when the person who was the primary architecture of their daily life is gone, but not broken, not the kind of widow who loses herself in the loss, still herself, still capable of the warmth and the dry observation and the firm opinion about certain dishes that had characterized her for as long as I had known her. I was her only child. That is a fact I need to say, and that the tin box revealed to me as something other than what I had always understood it to be, which was simply the fact of my family's size, the ordinary circumstance of a woman who had one child rather than several. The tin box told me that my mother had not always been the mother of one child, and that the singular status of my childhood was not the first singular status she had occupied, and that the woman I knew as my mother was a woman who had been, before she was my mother, a mother already, a mother of someone else, and that the someone else was a child she had lost in a way that I am going to describe, because the description is the whole of what I am trying to tell you. I opened the tin box on a Saturday afternoon in October of last year, 3 months after my mother's death in July at the age of 94. I had been avoiding the opening of it, not consciously exactly, not in the deliberate way that avoidance can be deliberate, but in the way that we avoid things, when the avoiding is easier than the confronting, and when there are always other things to attend to in the management of an estate and the processing of a loss. My wife Margaret was with me when I opened it, which I am grateful for, and which I mention because her presence and her particular quality of attention to what the opening produced in me was, in the hours that followed, important in ways I could not have anticipated. The tin box contained the following things: a photograph of a young woman who was unmistakably my mother, younger than I had ever seen her in any photograph, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, sitting on a porch step with a quality of ease and openness in her expression that I had not seen in any of the photographs from her adult life, an unguarded quality, the expression of someone who has not yet learned to be careful. In the photograph, she was sitting beside a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair and the build of someone who worked with his body, and they were sitting close in the particular way of two people who are comfortable with the physical fact of each other, and his arm was around her shoulder in the comfortable way of something established and ordinary rather than new. There were letters tied with a piece of ribbon that had faded to the color of old paper. I counted them before I read them, and there were 11, written in a hand I did not recognize on paper that had the brittleness of things from a long time ago, and they were addressed to my mother by a name I had not heard before, addressed to Irene, which was her name, but the address was not the address of the house in Pittsburgh, where she had grown up. It was an address in a different part of the city, and the return address on the envelopes was a name, a man's name, that I will call Joseph, because that was what it was, and because I see no reason to be indirect about it. A name my mother had never said in my presence in 68 years of my knowing her. There was a small card, the kind that comes with flowers, that said simply, "She was beautiful, and she was ours." There was no signature, and there was a single photograph of an infant, newborn by the look of it, wrapped in a white blanket and held by my mother, who was recognizable as herself, but younger than any photograph I had, younger than the woman on the porch step even, the face of a girl who has just done something enormous, and who is in the particular aftermath of that enormous thing, exhausted and open, and looking at the infant with an expression that I have seen in photographs of mothers, looking at newborns, and that I recognized, despite never having associated my mother with it before, as the expression of someone who has just understood something about love that they had not understood before. I sat with those things on the dining room table in front of me for a long time before I read the letters. Margaret sat beside me and did not say anything, which was exactly right, and I looked at the photograph of the infant and at the photograph of the young woman on the porch and at the card with its 8 words, and I understood, before I had read a single letter, the shape of what had happened, the outline of a story that was going to be confirmed and detailed by the letters, but whose essential content was already present in the 3 photographs and the small card, and the fact that none of it had ever been spoken about in the 71 years I had known my mother. She had a child before me. That was the shape of it. She had a child before me, and the child had died, or been taken from her, or been given away, and she had put everything that remained of that child, and that part of her life, into a tin box in the bottom drawer of her dresser, and had carried it there for the rest of her life, had carried it through her marriage to my father, and through my childhood, and through my adulthood, and through my father's death, and through the 23 years she lived alone, after his death, and through the 94 years of her life to its end, carrying it the way she carried everything heavy, which was without complaint and without explanation and without putting it down. I read the letters that evening. Margaret made dinner, and I ate some of it and went back to the letters and read them again. And what they told me, across 11 letters written across what appeared to be approximately a year and a half, was a story that I am going to tell you as clearly as I can, though I am telling it from the outside of it, and from the distance of 70 years after it happened, and from the position of a son who is trying to understand his mother, rather than from any direct knowledge of what she experienced. Joseph was a young man my mother had known since she was 15 years old. He was the son of a family in the same neighborhood, and from the letters, which were his letters to her rather than hers to him, I understood that what had existed between them was not a casual or brief thing, but something that had developed over several years, and that had, by the time the letters were written, the quality of something both of them understood as serious and intended to be permanent. The letters were not the letters of a young man who was uncertain about a girl. They were the letters of a young man who was certain, and who was writing from a distance because he had gone to work in another city. Pittsburgh to Cleveland, I understood from the postmarks, and who was writing to maintain a connection that he clearly intended to return to. The last 3 letters were different in their quality from the first 8. They were shorter, and their tone had changed in the specific way that the tone of letters changes when the person writing them is responding to something difficult in the correspondence they are receiving, when they are trying to say things in a situation that does not have easy things to say. Joseph wrote, in the 3rd to last letter, about his understanding of what had happened and his intention to return and his complete willingness, stated in language that was plain and without equivocation, to be present for everything that followed, to do right by her, to make the situation into what it should be. He wrote it clearly and with the conviction of someone who meant it, and the letter had been kept, which means my mother had kept it. And the keeping of it means something, though I cannot say with certainty what it means. The last letter was the shortest. It was dated 3 months after the 3rd to last letter, and it was a few sentences, and they said that he had come back to Pittsburgh, and that she had not been at the address where she usually was, and that he had gone to her family's house and been told that she was not available, and that he should not come back, and that he did not understand what had happened, and that he needed to hear from her, and that whatever had happened, he wanted her to know that he had meant what he had said in the previous letter, and that he was not going anywhere. There were no more letters after that one, which means either he stopped writing or she stopped keeping what he sent, and I cannot know which. And the not knowing is one of the several not knowings that I am carrying from the tin box, and that I am learning to hold without requiring them to resolve. I know from these materials that my mother was pregnant at some point in or around 1946 or 1947, when she would have been 17 or 18 years old. I know that Joseph was the father. I know that the child was born because the photograph of the infant exists, and my mother is holding the infant with the eye, expression of a woman who has given birth, rather than the expression of a woman who is holding someone else's child. I know that the child, whose name I do not know, and whose sex I cannot determine from the photograph, did not become a permanent part of my mother's life, because if it had, I would have known about it. And I know that Joseph did not become a permanent part of my mother's life either, because the letters stop, and 7 years later she married my father, and her life continued in the direction it continued in, which did not include Joseph, and did not include the child, except in the tin box in the bottom drawer. I want to tell you what I think happened, because I have been thinking about it for 3 months with the sustained attention that a person brings to something they cannot stop thinking about. And I want to be honest about the fact that what I think is reconstruction rather than knowledge is the story I have assembled from the available materials and from my understanding of who my mother was, and from the history of the time in which these events occurred, which is a history that provides its own kind of context for what the available options were for a 17-year-old girl in a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh in 1946 who was pregnant and unmarried. I think the child was given away. I think my mother's family, responding to the circumstances of 1946 with the responses available to a working-class Catholic family in that time and place, managed the situation in the way such situations were managed, which was quietly and privately, and in a direction that removed the visible evidence of what had happened from the family's daily life. I think the child was placed, either through adoption or through some other arrangement, and I think my mother was not given the full choice in the matter, or was given the kind of choice that is not a full choice, because the alternative to it was social and familial consequences that a 17-year-old could not realistically absorb. And I think Joseph came back to Pittsburgh and found that the situation had been resolved in his absence, and that my mother, whether by her own decision or by the management of the people around her, was no longer reachable in the way he had been reaching her. I think she spent the rest of her life carrying the child, not publicly, not in any form that could be seen or named or addressed, but in the interior space where she kept the tin box, in the particular quality of sadness that I always knew was present in her, and that I am only now, at 74, able to understand the source of. I want to talk about that sadness now, because it is the thing that the tin box illuminated for me in a way that nothing else had, and because the illumination of it is the thing I most want to account for in this telling. My mother was a warm woman. I want to say that first, because the portrait of a sad woman can sometimes obscure the full picture, and my mother was genuinely warm, with me and with her friends and with my father and with the grandchildren who came later, warm with the specific and real warmth of someone who loved the people in her life and expressed that love with consistency and care. But underneath the warmth, running alongside it in a way that was not always visible, but that I was aware of from an early age in the way that children are aware of the emotional weather of the people who raised them, there was something else, a quality that I had no name for as a child and that I described to myself as I grew older and had more vocabulary for such things as grief. A low and continuous grief that had no apparent object, that did not attach itself to any specific loss I was aware of in her history. That simply was there, a background condition of her emotional life that existed alongside the warmth and the love and the dry humor and all the other things she was. I asked her about it once when I was in my 30s, not using the word grief, but asking her whether she was happy, whether something was bothering her, whether there was something I could do. She looked at me with an expression that I remember very clearly, because it was an expression I had not seen on her face before, an expression of someone who has just been asked the one question they cannot answer, and who is trying to find the kindest way not to answer it. And she said, "Thomas, I have had a very good life, and I have you and your father and all the things that matter, and I am grateful for all of it." And then she changed the subject, and I let her change it, because that is what we did in my family with the subjects that were changed, and I filed the question away and did not ask it again. Now I know what she would have said if she had been able to say it, or not what she would have said, because I cannot know that, but what the true answer was to the question I was asking, which is that there was someone missing. There had always been someone missing. The life she was living, the good life with the husband and the son, and all the things that mattered, was a life from which someone had been removed before it had fully begun. And the removing had not resolved the love she had for the removed person, had not stopped the grief of the removal, had simply required her to carry the grief without a name for it, without a context in which it could be acknowledged, in the tin box in the bottom drawer, along with 11 letters and 2 photographs, and a small card with 8 words on it. She had carried it for 75 years. I am doing the arithmetic right. She would have been approximately 19 when the child was born or given away, and she died at 94. 75 years. The entirety of the life I knew her for and more, carrying a grief that had no permitted expression, and that she had apparently decided, at some point early in the carrying, could not be shared with anyone who came after, could not be brought into the life she was building, because the building of the life required the separation of the new life from the old one. And the tin box was the vessel for the old one, and the bottom drawer was where the vessel lived. I have spent 3 months asking myself whether I wish she had told me. It is not a simple question, and I want to give it the unsimple answer it deserves. There is a part of me that wishes she had told me, that wishes I had known while she was alive, and while a conversation about it was possible. That wishes I could have sat beside her somewhere and heard the story in her words, rather than in the reconstruction I have assembled from the tin box, and from my own guesses about the history of a time I did not live through. The conversation that could have happened, if she had told me, would have been one of the most significant conversations of my life, and the not having of it is a loss I feel genuinely. But there is another part of me, a part that has grown larger across the 3 months of sitting with this, that understands why she did not tell me, that understands it not as a withholding from me specifically, but as the last form of protection she had available for the child she had lost, and for herself, the maintenance of a privacy around the most interior and most painful thing in her life that was perhaps the only form of control she had been able to maintain over something that she had originally had very little control over at all. She had not chosen the situation at 17. She had not, I believe, fully chosen the resolution of it. What she had chosen, in the years that followed, was how to carry what she was carrying, and she had carried it in the only way she knew how, which was quietly and without burdening the people she loved with the weight of it. That is not the choice I would have made. I want to say that because I think honesty requires me to say it, even as I understand and accept her choice. I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted to be trusted with it. But I also understand, at 74, that my mother was formed by a different world than the one I was formed by, a world in which the particular shame attached to what had happened to her at 17 was not a private shame, but a social one, a public one that had the capacity to define a person in their community and in their family in ways that were not reversible, and that my mother had apparently decided long ago were not going to define her in the life she built afterward. She built a good life. I need to keep coming back to that, because I think the story I am telling could be heard as the story of a life diminished by loss, and that is not what it was. She built a genuine and full life, a life with real love in it and real warmth and real meaning, and she carried the loss inside the fullness of it for 75 years, and it did not destroy the fullness, even though it was always there alongside it. And that carrying is itself something I want to honor, something that I think deserves acknowledgement as a form of strength rather than only as a form of tragedy. But I also think about the child. I think about the child a great deal, and this is the part of the story that I have the least to say about, because it is the part one knows the least about, which is not nothing to say when you are trying to be honest about what you know and what you don't. Somewhere in 1946 or 1947, a child was born to my mother and placed into a life that was not my mother's life, into a family or a series of families, or whatever arrangement was made, and that child grew up without knowing that the woman in the photograph on the porch step existed, or knowing that they had been born to her and had been given away, or knowing some version of the story that I cannot access. That child would be in their late 70s now, if they are alive. They would be approximately my own age within a few years, which is a fact that has a strange and specific quality to it, the quality of a parallel that was always running alongside my own life without my knowing it was running. A sibling in the broadest sense of the word, someone who shares my mother with me in a way that neither of us knew about and that my mother kept from both of us simultaneously. My daughter, whose name is Carolyn, and who is 48 years old, asked me after I told her about the tin box whether I was going to try to find out what happened to the child. It was the practical question, the logical next step If you are the kind of person who follows the discovery of a thing with the investigation of the thing, and Caroline is that kind of person, organized and forward-moving, and inclined toward the resolution of open questions rather than the sustained carrying of them. I told her I was thinking about it, which was true, and that I was not sure yet, which was also true, and that I needed more time with what I already knew before I could decide what to do with the not knowing. I am still in that more time. The 3 months since the tin box have been spent mostly in the sitting with, rather than the acting on, and I am not sure yet whether the acting on is the right thing, or whether what the situation calls for is something more interior. The private integration of what I have learned into my understanding of my mother, and of the family I come from, and of the woman who carried a grief I could not understand for the entirety of the time I knew her. What I am certain of is that the discovery has changed my understanding of my mother in a way that is both painful and, in a complicated way, a relief. It is painful because it is the story of a loss that she bore without being able to speak about it, and because I can see now, with the understanding the tin box provides, the shape of a grief that I was always aware of, but never able to locate, and the locating of it is partly a comfort and partly the confirmation of something I had always half known, which is that there was something she was not telling me, something large and foundational that the life she presented to me rested on without being visible in it. And it is a relief, because the question I had been asking about her for most of my adult life, the question of why she sometimes seemed to be grieving something invisible, has been answered. Not completely, not in the way that all the not knowing resolves into knowing, but in the essential way, the way that makes the previously inexplicable explicable, that gives the previously unnamed thing its name. She was grieving something invisible, because the thing she was grieving was not permitted to be visible. The child was invisible. The grief for the child was invisible. The love for the child was invisible. All of it sealed in a tin box in the bottom drawer. And the grief I had always sensed in her without being able to explain, it was the grief of a woman living her visible life alongside an invisible one, carrying the invisible one with the consistency and the quiet that she brought to everything she carried. She was extraordinary. That is the thing I keep arriving at 3 months in, when I sit with everything the tin box has shown me. Not extraordinary in the sense of unusual, because I know now that her story was not unusual for its time, that women of her generation and circumstance carried exactly this kind of invisible weight in exactly this kind of private way, that the tin box in the bottom drawer was a common enough form of storage for the things that could not be acknowledged in the life that continued above it. But extraordinary in the specific and personal sense, in the sense of a woman who carried what she carried for 75 years and continued to be warm and present and genuine with the people she loved, continued to be my mother in the full and real sense, continued to make the good life and live the good life, and be the person I knew and loved without the carrying being, visible in any way that allowed me to understand what was underneath it until I found the tin box 3 months after she died. I want to tell you one more thing before I finish, which is about Joseph. I thought about him a great deal in the weeks after reading the letters, about the young man in the photograph with his arm around my mother's shoulder, and the particular quality of ease and comfort in their posture, about the letters he wrote that moved from certainty to confusion, to the final short letter that did not know what had happened, but stated that it had not changed anything he felt. I do not know what happened to Joseph. I do not know whether he ever found out what had happened to my mother and to the child, whether the explanation was eventually provided, or whether he spent some portion of his own life in a not knowing that mirrored my mother's, carrying his own version of the invisible weight in his own version of the tin box. I hope he was told. I hope that is what happened, that someone found a way to let him know, because the letters suggest a man who deserved to know, and who would have received the knowing with the seriousness it deserved. But I cannot know that, and it is one of the several not knowings that I am carrying, alongside the question of the child, and the question of what my mother felt in the privacy of the life she built after, and I am carrying them the way she taught me to carry things, which is without putting them down and without requiring them to resolve before I can continue. She taught me that without meaning to. She taught me that by example, across 68 years of being my mother, and the lesson was not visible to me while she was teaching it, and is visible now, in a way that has changed the quality of my understanding of her and of her life and of my own life, which is continuous with hers in all the ways that a child's life is continuous with the life of the parent who made them. I am the child she kept. I have thought about that in these 3 months, about what that means and what it does not mean. And what I have arrived at is not a clean or simple conclusion, but something more like a holding, an acknowledgement of the full complexity of the thing, without requiring any part of it to be simpler than it is. I am the child she kept, and there was another child she could not keep, and she loved both of us in the way she was capable of loving, which in my case was openly and consistently and fully, and in the other case was in the only way the circumstances permitted, which was silently and privately, and in a tin box in the bottom drawer for 75 years. Both of those loves were real. I am certain of that, as certain as I am of anything I have come to understand in 74 years of living. Both of those children were loved by her, in the forms that the different circumstances of their existence permitted, and the love for the one she lost did not diminish the love for the one she kept, did not compete with it or compromise it, simply lived alongside it in the interior space that she maintained for it, the space that was hers alone, and that she carried to the end, and that she left me to discover, perhaps intentionally, and perhaps not, in a tin box in a bottom drawer on a Saturday afternoon in October. My mother was Irene. She was born in 1928, and she died in 2024 at the age of 94, and she kept a secret for 75 years that was not, I have come to understand, primarily a secret from me, but primarily a form of the only continuing relationship available to her with a child she had loved and lost before the life I knew her in had even begun. She kept faith with that child in the only way the world she lived in permitted, and the faith was quiet and consistent and lasted until she died, and I found it in a tin box, and I am carrying it now, and I will carry it carefully, the way she carried everything that mattered to her, which was with the full and private and unglamorous attention of someone who understands that some things cannot be put down, and who has decided that the carrying, however long it takes, is what love requires. That is what I wanted you to know about my mother. She was more than I knew, and what she was more of was not less of a mother to me, but more of a person. And the more of a person she was, is what I am still, at 74, in the process of learning to hold.